Welcome, Mike. Thanks for hopping on here with me. I'm happy to have you on. Usually, as usual, start off with a little bit of a self-introduction. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and what you do.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, thank you for having me. I'm Mike Kaeding, CEO of Norhart. We design, build, and rent apartments, but we're really focused on driving down the cost of construction. We've been achieving about a 20 to 30% reduction in those construction costs, and we believe that over time we can achieve a 50% reduction. But imagine what that means. That means someday your rent or your mortgage payment could be half. And that's our dream, is in the places of the world that are struggling with housing affordability, we want to solve that problem.
Wow, it's interesting that you take that point of view, because I lived in Austin for many years, and there's a startup there called Icon, and their main goal is just that, right? Reducing the cost of living. Especially right now, they're focusing on the U.S. and I think they're doing a couple projects outside the U.S. But they're focusing on doing 3D printing and changing the method of construction. Which I'm by background, I'm a structural engineer, and that's never really made sense to me. Like it doesn't. I don't think it's so much a construction issue as much as it is a finance issue. Obviously, you can reduce the cost of construction. So yeah, I'm curious how you approach it and specifically, and how you reduce those costs and what your opinion is there. So
yeah, I think the 3D printing is super interesting, but at least at present, it's not really solving costs. It's just a different technique. I think it's one piece to a much larger puzzle to actually solve construction costs. In fact, if you look at other industries like manufacturing, they've improved labor productivity by 760% over the past 60 years. If you look at agriculture, they've improved it by 1,500%. But in the world of construction, it's been virtually nothing at just 10% growth over 60 years. And so if we just take the lessons learned from these other industries and apply it to our own, we can see success. I mean, if construction were making cell phones, all our cell phones today would still be giant bricks that cost us $10,000, right? We don't put up with that in technology. Why are we okay with that in the world of construction? So what we did is we started taking those lessons. We actually partnered with groups like Toyota, who has mastered how to improve manufacturing processes. And one of the first key things we did was we brought all of the work under one roof. See, in the world of construction, you typically have a variety of companies that come together to work on one project, and then they split apart, including people like yourself, like engineers. And in manufacturing, that's not the case. It's a lot of the same group of people. If a construction company were to produce cars, you'd have a different person installing the windshield, a different person installing the door, and a different person installing the wheel. And of course, the wheel company, they would call you up and say, hey, I'm so sorry, but I got delayed on another project and I can't get back out to you for 2 weeks. You would look at them and, just be stuck. Your entire line would be shut down. See, manufacturing looks at us and says we're crazy, and we look back at them and say this is the way it's always been done. So once we bring all the work under one roof, which that alone saves good money, but we can apply some very simple techniques. One technique is the assembly line. Well, sounds good in principle, but how the heck do you take a building and drive it down a line? Well, you can't. But what you can do is you can take the person and move them through the building. And so right now we break our building into small batches about the size of one unit. And about every 5 hours, our teams shift through the building by one unit. And so if you look at the end of our buildings, we have a brand new apartment unit completed every 5 hours. And that one technique might take a project that might take 15 months and drive it down to 9. But there are 10,000 little techniques like that when brought together that actually make the cost impact we're hoping to have.
So just to make sure that I'm following, say you have a semi-completed building and you needed to paint each unit. Is that what you're saying? So you take your painting team and you put them in unit 1, and then you shift over to unit 2, unit 3. I mean, how is that different than what you would do regularly?
Yeah, so for this particular strategy, what it ends up doing is you condense the space that work is being done within, right? Because if you're thinking about it, a painter just does their painting, just goes on. How is that any better or faster? Well, in the world of painting, and especially in things like drywall, they want entire areas cleared out. Everything is just there, ready for them. They want a floor so they can just fly and then get out of there. Well, they're not working on the entire floor at once. They're working on just one part of that floor. So that means there's big chunks of the building that nothing is being done. Because of that, it extends the window that projects take to get complete, which then increase costs on things like interest expense. So that's how that one technique helps reduce some of those costs.
Okay, and then I guess the follow-up question would be, is a apartment complex isn't built unit by unit, right? It's built, there's the foundation, there's the walls, there's certain parts of it that are all erected simultaneously. So it's not like you're erecting one unit at a time, unless you're doing some kind of modular construction that's more in a fabrication setting, right? And more indoors and brought to site. So
yeah,
is that what you're doing?
Point. And I can tell you're a structural engineer, or an engineer just in general. The way you do it is you actually are building unit by unit. So if you go out there and see the framers work, it's one unit at a time. Now, there are certain pieces of that puzzle that don't quite fit into that. And foundation, precast concrete are some of those pieces. But you can still batch those particular processes. And so we actually work on these small vertical towers that are about 6 units on one base. And we actually build up and go to the next tower, build up again. So the foundation on that part may not be 1 unit, but it might be the size of 6 to 10 units. So we still get a lot of that benefit, maybe not quite as good as down to 1 unit for foundation. Then there's other things like you've got to run electrical feeders to all the units. And so there's other pieces of this puzzle. You just have to have other methods to solve. But I would say that 80 to 90% of everything fits within that batch system.
And do you sort of take the approach of having all your different disciplines of engineers under the same roof, whether it be architects, MEP, structural, all that? Is that all, I guess, subcontracted, or is that part of the GC team, or how do you organize all that? Because oftentimes, right, like you're the structural engineer, you want this column here, but you're arguing with the architect, and not everyone's in agreement, and everyone's just trying to do their own job without actually finding any sense of efficiency, in my opinion. Yeah. How do you organize that?
Gosh, you were speaking to the choir. We have lived that experience. What I have found, so it is all under one roof now. It is all our own staff. But what we found is that when we had third parties do that work, they're not optimizing for building efficiency or design efficiency. They're optimizing for their own profitability, which means that they're producing the set of plans that meets codes, that's good enough, and then they're done. They're out of there. The last thing they want to do is coordinate with a bunch of other people, because that just means more work and more time and maybe a lack of profitability. So we've had many projects in the past that have struggled because of that lack of overall coordination. So we ended up bringing all of that under one roof. We have our own team, and frankly, I think we have some of the top people in the country, engineers and architects, that are thinking about this problem. But because you bring them all under one roof, they no longer have this constraint of profitability. They're just optimizing for the best possible design. And so they start thinking about things differently. They actually spend time on things like joists. We have steel joists in some of our buildings. They go to the point of doing like dissertations on those steel joists, deep level calculations to figure out what is the most optimized steel joist for a 28-foot span, right? And exactly how are those holes placed, and what is the flange thickness, the thickness of the steel, like all of those things go into play. In fact, they get so detailed that they'll actually go back to the governing bodies, the federal government, and actually they've caught errors in the code before and actually had the code bodies correct the errors that they found because they're just going so deep and optimizing what we're working on.
And do you have a design build structure contract, or is that something that isn't sort of in your scope? You know, I know that it's definitely something that's more common, I'd say, in like the public arena rather than in the private, but it's catching some wind. So I'm curious if that's something that you've looked into.
So we don't have a design build contract in the sense that we don't need contracts because it's all of our own team.
Mm-hmm.
But the philosophy of design build, having this more like iterative process and getting more direct feedback as we go along is absolutely part of it. Our one thing that I love about having internal engineers and architects is they fly out to our sites on a fairly regular basis. They do meetings with all of the staff. They have these brainstorming sessions with the teams to figure out what they're struggling with and how they can fix those issues. See, back when it was a separate companies, they would be like, no way to all of that. That's your problem to figure out. But like to do this most efficiently, you need both sides working together, building those relationships and solving those issues.
Yeah, I guess at the end of the day, like defining it like that as a design build isn't really make sense in your context, right? Because you're the investor, the GC, the subcontractor, you're everything, right? I mean, you're the entire, you're completely, I guess, vertically integrated, which is not, I've never heard of anybody going that far along. So that's fair.
Yeah, it's a little nerve-wracking, right? It's terrifying in the sense that you've got to have a strong enough business that you're producing enough demand, right? So we're building enough buildings and we've got a good pipeline for that. So that's the challenge. That's the downside, which is why most people don't do it. But the upside is we see significant improvement in costs. And so then even when there are down markets, other people's projects may no longer financially pencil out, but ours still do because our costs are low enough.
And have you sort of focused in? I know from what I've read about you is that you mostly focus on multi-family residential. So was that intentional, sort of just be able to focus in and start to become an expert in this area and be able to churn out more projects that you're more comfortable doing? Was that the reasoning, or was that just
Exactly.
the background that you had?
No, certainly that is my background, but we're not jumping into a bunch of other types of construction very intentionally. And there's some very public failure companies that have struggled or failed because they spread themselves way too wide, too fast. And the problem is, Elon Musk talks about this, how it's hard to produce a car, but it is 10 to 100 to 1,000 times harder to build the system that builds that car. And the same is true in the world of construction. And so to give us the best possible chance of success, we want to minimize that scope so that we can get really, really good at building, for us right now, apartments.
Great. And so can you speak a little bit about, since we were talking about your background, sort of where you started, and I know obviously we're talking about where you are now, but how did the company start and how did you get where you are today? So
Yeah. Originally it was a family business, and my parents started it very small. We just had a few units and buildings we'd build throughout the years. And I remember my parents actually lost everything at one point. We built that back up. In fact, as a side story, my dad was actually kidnapped in Peru. Crazy side story. But we built everything back up, and I went off to college. And when I was in college, I knew one thing, and that is that I wanted nothing to do with the family business. And the reason that is that I didn't want people to think it was given to me. What I realized deep down is that I wanted to make some kind of meaningful, positive impact in the world. And why not take this opportunity to take this small business and grow it to the point that has that kind of impact? So I had to work past my own ego, which was a bit of a struggle. And I jumped in full time with my dad after college. And we doubled the size of the company within the first couple of years of working together. It was great. And then one day, unexpectedly, my dad passed away. And overnight, I became CEO of this organization. And in fact, I didn't take the title of CEO for like 5 years because I didn't feel like I was worthy. I didn't feel like I'd earned it. And it was a big struggle. We struggled quite heavily for a number of years. But eventually we got past that. We worked through that and we started seeing some pretty wild growth. For many years, we were doubling in size every year. And so that's what's led to today.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
It must have been a difficult time in your life. I think, a lot of people that take over the family business have the feeling, it's something that's crossed my mind. I'm not exactly there yet, but I've had a similar situation. And, there's always the multiple fears, I'd say. Like, one, it's that, like you said, that someone may say that like you were given it and not earned. But then also there's the fear of, if you make a change, is that change going to be respected? Have you earned the right to give that direction, right? And will it be received in the same way? And obviously, if you have your father, which is the CEO, right? Like, every generation wants to make changes that the previous generation wouldn't be willing to do, and obviously, I guess, unfortunately, you maybe didn't have that issue. Maybe in the beginning you did. But it's definitely like that. It's an issue for the parents that started it, right? Where they're like willing to hand it off, and then the children that are needing to receive it as well. So it's a little bit of a game there that you're playing, right? So
yeah, it's a hard challenge. One of the things that probably benefited me is I grew up with it, so I knew the staff that we had before joining full time. But beyond that, we were actually a very small company, just a handful of staff members in those early years that I started. So that helped some of that. But it's certainly something I wrestle a lot with, even with my own kids. Like, I have no idea if they'll be interested in the family business someday. And I don't want to just put them in this if it's not the right fit for them, if it's not the right fit for the organization. But even so, like, my parents lost everything growing up, and I had to work on these job sites. I had to be out there. I had to swing a hammer, sweep rooms, flatten nails. I didn't want to be there, but that experience gave me a much deeper understanding of how these projects came together and gave me that work ethic. It's hard to give that same thing to my own kids, my own daughters, because first off, they don't have to be on any site. And secondly, like, we're not in a position, like, it wouldn't be smart to have kids on a construction site, things like that. And so I fear a little bit, like, what does that mean? Will they not get the experience that they need to be successful in the long term? And I don't quite know how to solve that.
And I think, obviously, I don't know your situation, and I'm just commenting in general. I'm just thinking that an error that I often see from parents is sort of thinking that the way they did it is the correct way to do things, right? And so then maybe from a place of fear or a place of just wanting, from a place of wanting to just take care of your children and make sure that they're in a safe place, right? They say, okay, this is what you should do, and depending on where the child is at in their life, or depending on their level of maturity and the clarity that they have about where they're going and what they want to do with their lives, they interpret that as, okay, I have to do this, and then they're never allowed to forge their own path,
Yeah.
So it's a balancing line, but I often see parents do that. So
That's such a great point. And the reality is, you learn through repeated and fast failure, right? You've got to get out there, skin your knees, try things, and realize that doesn't work. You can't just always have the guardrails on to this like perfect path, because then you don't know what you're doing. You haven't learned that. And so, how do you balance that? How do you give them that freedom and capability to forge your own path, to find a new direction, to fail a few times, while also not like crushing the business? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the answer is to go out, make errors and then somebody else's business, right? Like work for a few years, somebody else, and then come into the family business instead of just, right? Because even the experience, say, of having a boss is an experience in and of itself. And, I guess maybe, have you ever had a boss other than your father, right? Like that could be something that you could, look into, right? I mean, it's an experience where you realize that, I guess you get a sense of responsibility, and then you get a sense of that you're not the center of the world. If that, maybe that's a bit of an esoteric view on it, right? But that realization is an important one to have. So
yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So continuing along, I guess, you took over the family business, and if you don't want to talk about it, it's fine. I was just like, you sort of skimmed over your father in Peru and all that stuff, and me being in Colombia, I was curious what that story is. Okay.
Yeah, so my parents were always very philanthropic. They wanted to support the people around them. And so they were actually really big into the Special Olympics. One year, the Special Olympics were in Minnesota. And there were a number of families from around the world that came to Minnesota. And my parents actually hosted some of those families, so they had a place to stay. One of those families, the father's name was Pancho. And over the course of months, my parents and Pancho, they built this great relationship. And Pancho was from Peru. And in Peru at the time, they didn't have the greatest public transportation. And so my parents wanted to help Pancho create a transportation network within Peru. So they would buy buses from the United States, send them down to Peru, and Pancho would operate those buses down here. And we did that. My parents took out loans, purchased those buses, sent them to Peru, and then Pancho operated the buses, started sending money back to my parents to pay off the buses. Everything was working great until it didn't. Over time, Pancho stopped sending the money to my parents. And my dad went down to Pancho every month or so down to Peru. And one of those trips down to Peru, finished that story off and went to Supreme Court, and it ended up being some corruption in the courts. But one of the times my dad went down to Peru, he was walking along the beach. And this guy comes up to him and says, "Dude, you're an American. Like, tell me all about what America is like. I want to know everything about it." And then he ran off. And my dad was like, "That was weird." And then a few minutes later, 4 uniformed police officers showed up and said, "That man you were just talking to, he's a known drug dealer. And now you need to come to the police station with us." So they walk my dad to their car. They walk and have him sit in the back middle seat. It's a pretty small 2-door car. 2 guys in the front 2 seats, 2 guys on either side of him in the back 2 seats. And the moment he got in, he knew he made a mistake. These weren't real police officers. They started asking him for money and trying to figure out, where he was from, all this stuff. And he was showing them, "I have not no money." They started heading to the bad part of town, the part of town that my dad knew that they should never go to. On the way there, my dad started formulating a plan because he knew he had to get out of this. Like, if he didn't, he wasn't sure what was going to happen, but he sure knew it wasn't going to be good. And so he'd actually been mugged before this point, and He looked like the kind of guy you wanted to mug, like some American that maybe had some money but just looked like a dumb American. And he realized that you have about 1 second before people know what you're doing. And so as they were heading down to the bad part of town, he started formulating a plan. He said, once we start slowing down for the next stoplight, once we get to about 15 miles an hour, I'm going to take action and jump out within 1 second. So he was watching the speedometer, 45, 30, 20, got down to 15 miles an hour. He leapt over the passenger in the passenger seat, grabbed the door handle, opened it up, and let the momentum of the slowing car whip open that door as it physically pulled him out of the car, and he ran backwards down traffic and escaped safely. And he made it through. And that's the story of my dad in Peru.
That's a good story for a night at a bar or something like that.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, it's a little crazy.
Yeah, wow. Peru. How did he end up meeting these people, or the original bus rental?
Yeah, so it was
person.
through that work with Special Olympics, because Pancho's, I believe it was his daughter, had special needs and was competing in the Special Olympics. And so Pancho, his wife, stayed with my parents in Minnesota, and that's how they built the relationship.
Wow. That's a little bit convoluted and crazy and interesting. Wow. Seems like a man that lived life. Awesome. That was interesting. Great. So I guess I'm just moving along as well. So you, I guess, a couple of years after, I'm not sure when this happened, right? But a couple of years after this, you were left the company all to yourself. And those first few years, you said that it was, you had some difficulties and such. And is that something that, like what exactly do you think got you through those years, and what changed? Did anything change in the way that you saw life? Like, I know what is this saying that a man or a boy doesn't become a man until the death of his father, right? Whether it's a physical death or a metaphorical one. So I'm curious how your view on life changed, and then what struggles you went through in those few years.
That was a huge challenge. I mean, every step of growth, there's huge challenges. But after my dad passed away, we had a project we were working on called Emberwood. It was an apartment building that we were building, and I had to get through city council approvals, and city staff was a little weary of me. I didn't understand the importance of building relationships and connections, and so I didn't get off on the right foot, and those were my issues. But after starting construction, the city was really unsure of what I was doing. In fact, they looked at me as some pipsqueak kid, and frankly, looking back at it, I was, right? I didn't really know what I was doing. I'd been on the construction sites for years, but I didn't really understand things at the level that I needed to know them. In fact, it got so tough that the city shut us down, not just once, but twice. And the second time they shut us down, they brought me into the city hall. And I could vividly remember this. Sat me down with all the heads of the city and said, Mike, we don't think you have what it takes to do this. In fact, you can't start work up again until you find someone who can fill that role for you, right? How deflating is that? And we were stuck. We had a whole team would be out of work unless we solved this problem. And so we raced to find someone, which is the worst way to find someone of importance in your company. We found someone in just 3 days. And they worked as sort of a front for us with the city. Well, we solved all of the problems behind the scenes for them. But I remember just about a month or two before we were supposed to open that we had a water main that was over 1,000 feet long buried 15 feet in the ground. And we did a pressure test in that water main and it failed, meaning that there was some pinhole, tiny water leak somewhere buried out there in this field. And we had to go find it. It's horrible. My excavator wanted to get off of that job like nobody's business. He had other people calling him, demanding them get out there. And the only thing I could think to do was I was just with them day after day from sunrise to sunset. I was in my nice clothes, but down there in the mud looking for this leak somewhere. And it was horrible. But eventually we found the leak after weeks. And then I remember just a few days before we were supposed to open, the city staff came out and looked at our site and said, there's no way. There's no way you're opening this. I mean, we have families that are about to move in, and this is going to be their home. They have nowhere else to stay. And unless we can figure this out, they're out of a home, right? This is terrible. We worked through the night for several days until the last day. We had about a half a dozen inspectors show up for a half-day inspection. They looked at every nook and cranny of that building. I remember the end. I'll never forget this. The head building official pulled me aside in the parking garage. He said, Mike, I know we were hard on you. Honestly, this is the nicest building that we've opened in this city. I was like, oh, finally, right? Years of not feeling like I'm good enough, like I'm struggling, and being told that from other people that had power over me. Right? It was horrible. But for there to be one moment that they looked down and said, maybe you can do this. Oh, it was such an important moment in my life and helped transform the way that I thought about things and gave me more strength to move forward.
So what kept you going all the years that you felt that you were being told that you were not enough, as you said?
Yeah, it was really hard. I think part of what kept me going is that I knew I had a team. And I knew if I stopped, that team is out of a job, right? Like, to me, there was really no other option. So it was just, okay, I run into another problem. Put one foot in front of another, in front of another. It's what am I going to do the next hour? What am I going to do the next 4 hours? What am I going to do tomorrow? So that I can move these things forward to actually solve the issues at hand. Probably more than anything else, it was just making a choice, despite how terrible it felt, just to move forward.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a skill to be able to take a difficult task, or just any task, I guess, and break it down into actionable items.
Yeah.
Right? It's a test of self-reliance, I would say, which I've realized many people, it's an attribute that many people don't have. It's a muscle that you need to that you need to train, right? That self-reliance muscle.
Yeah, I've met many people that talk about having a really great goal, something they're super excited about, and then I find out that there's no actions they're taking today. There's no actions they're taking tomorrow. There's no actions they're taking next week to actually walk them meaningfully forward to that goal. And so there's like this cognitive dissonance of, I want this thing that's out there, but today I want to go watch Netflix. And because of that, they never reach that long-term goal. To achieve that, you need to think about where you need to be the next year, 6 months, next month, tomorrow, the next hour, and take the actions you need to take.
Yeah, I mean, when you have such a large goal, it can be overwhelming. So it's not to not to speak negatively of these people. It's I found myself in that situation before, and I think it's, in my opinion, like what helped me personally is, I mean, it's a bit cliche, but it's like sort of enjoying the process, right?
Yeah.
It's what is that metaphor of, carrying the rock up the hill and learning to love it? The Greek metaphor. or allegory. But yeah, it's undervalued, and I think it's not only learning to enjoy the process, but it's also just um, if you define your self-worth based on sort of whether you've reached the goal or not, then I found myself in that position, then that I feel is what also tends to freeze people up and cause them to not move forward, right? And then they just get into a vicious cycle that, and then they'll watch more Netflix rather than moving forward, right? So I think it's and that's attributed a little bit to self-reliance, right? It's like realizing that I guess no one's coming to help you. Like it's like you need to get up and do it, right? A little bit of bootstrap type of a aspect to it as well.
Yeah, exactly. And you brought up a really interesting point, which is to learn to love what you're doing. I think one important thing is you need to understand who you are so that you can line yourself, your natural tendencies to put yourself in a spot that you're most likely going to love what you're doing. But there's still, even when you do that, there's pieces and parts of what you're doing you're not going to want to do. You're not going to want to get up some mornings. But taking the steps forward, just taking action, what I find is that you start to learn to appreciate it and to enjoy it along the way. The opposite is also true. I've seen this in my own self. Like when I don't feel like getting out of bed in the morning and I just lay in bed instead, I'm actually less motivated than I was an hour before, right? But if I take action, I actually feel more motivated after taking that action. So you kind of have to like be proactive, take the action rather than waiting for yourself to feel a certain way.
I think it was who was it? I don't think it was Jeff Bezos. It was Bill Gates. I think is one of the two said that stress isn't due to the actual task. It's due to the inaction of completing the task.
Yeah.
Right. So it's an interesting realization when you realize that you're in control of your life, right? It's like it's empowering, definitely. So
yeah, and the other part of stress too that I've learned is that the things that feel stressful are directly related to your capacity to handle problems. And so as a kid, like having to mow the lawn might feel incredibly stressful. But as you get older and become a more adult, like you get really good at that stuff. And now those no longer stress you out. But I've seen that every step in my own journey and our own growth as a company, where maybe today $100 million problem might stress me out. But like what stressed me out 2 or 3 years ago is like, why was I ever stressed about that? That's no big deal. And so our feeling of stress is very much correlated with how capable we become at tackling challenging issues.
And I think, whenever there's always, let's say you're feeling some stress or you're feeling some anxiety, I think there's like a connotation, for lack of better words, sort of a connotation of resistance, right? It's like or hostility, right? Like the way that I read it recently was that anxiety is just another word for hostility. And what I mean by that is, okay, I'm anxious about all the things I need to do next year for the business, or anxious about anything, right? Like I have a family reunion that I need to see somebody I don't want to see, right? Just whatever it may, however small it could be, right? You have hostility towards that, and you have resistance towards it, and so that's really what's causing the anxiety, right? And so then you're sort of again, you're sort of handing off responsibility for your life to somebody else and putting it in their hands. It's a subtlety that I realized recently. I don't know if you agree or what's your take on that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. What is it? Something along the quotes of, if you poke a man with an umbrella and he gets angry, and then the guy's like, You made me angry. Well, no, I poked you with an umbrella. You got angry all by yourself, right? Like, we have a choice in how I respond. And one of the most important lessons I ever learned is this notion that there's a space between stimulus and response. And in that space is our freedom and power to choose. And so, regardless of the stimulus, we can choose a different response, but here's the magic. The way we choose to respond will eventually become the way we feel about it. It's not the other way around. So you can actually drive how you feel based upon how you choose to respond.
What is it that they say? If you want to change how you feel about something, change how you act. And if you want to change how you act, change how you feel about it. So it, two sides of the same coin. So I think, there is not enough importance put onto sort of having emotional, like sort of your EQ versus the IQ, and oftentimes, a lot of times, like, okay, women are said that, and this is not me trying to, bash on women or anything. It's just like women are often told that they have higher EQs than men. And it's like, okay, how are we defining EQ, right? Are we saying it's your ability to have contact with your emotions, or your ability to sort of interpret and respond to your emotions, right? Like, like a child feels an emotion and reacts to it, and like a highly functioning adult feels an emotion, decides how he wants to respond to it, and then acts. So it's, again, that space that you're talking about between the feeling and the action. So
yeah, there are Buddhist monks, and just anyone who kind of practices mindfulness, that I know I don't do really myself, but I've always found interesting from like a third party perspective, because they have such a control over their own mindset about the world that they live in such a high degree of peace and harmony as a result of that. And that's their whole like focus, is how do I get really good about monitoring my own inner world, that I feel good about life and where I'm at. And I think a lot of people don't understand the power they have in really driving how they feel. Especially those who look at the world and say it's all a problem that's out there. It's their issue, their problem. That's why I'm in the situation I'm in. But if you think like that, not only will you feel bad about it, but you also can't make any change or meaningful improvement as a result of that. So, yeah, I think this whole idea is so important to success and to feeling good about life.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's you're in control of your heading, right, of where you sail. So can't really put that on anybody else. But yeah, so did you have a comment or?
No, this is great. It's such a useful point.
Yeah. And, now that you mentioned Buddhism and all that, like, I often contemplate that, some of the Western philosophies are sort of rooted in the same ideas, but oftentimes Buddhists and Eastern philosophy has sort of a better capacity to explain them and put them into words, and potentially, it could, like, say the Bible, I don't know, maybe in the area of the time, they just didn't have the depth to explain it to that level. So then they put it into a form that could be more easily understood, even though possibly it was, it's possibly had the same implications or intentions as some of the more commonly known Eastern philosophies, so like Buddhism and things like that. So this is something that I've heard. I don't know if you've ever read a book called The Power of Now, by it's a guy called Eckhart Tolle, and you know, in his book he uses everything from like Sanskrit to, you know, the Bible and just the Quran and just everything, right? And he pulls it and sort of puts it all into the same perspective, right? It puts it in and sort of sets the intentionality of it all in the same direction. So love that book, but I highly recommend everybody. I'm always recommending that book to people, but
I love it. Yeah. I try to read a lot, and so I love those book recommendations just to help me learn and grow.
Definitely. But let's get back to sort of to your story here. So you were struggling the first few years, and then you sort of got a little more comfortable. You had a little bit more validation from the city and all this, like you're saying, right? And then when did you sort of come to fruition, if you will, of having your own mission? Because it seems to me, you know, from an outsider perspective that, you know, okay, your father had a goal for the company and a direction that you wanted in, but then you seem to have found your own purpose within the frameworks of the company, and seem to have your own purpose, right? Which is what you've sort of described of reducing costs and sort of solving homelessness, if correct me if I'm wrong. And so when did that realization come, right? Or like, it seems like, you know, you found your own purpose, and luckily you've been able to bring it about with the company that you already had established. So
Yeah, it was definitely an evolution. You know, I think one thing, people sometimes think they have to go away for a weekend and just figure out what their purpose, their vision, their mission is for their lives or their company. And what I've learned is that you gotta be okay with like bumping into the walls, right? We're trying something out, feeling it out, realizing that's not quite working and not resonating with customers, employees don't love that, and kind of going back and forth over the course of years to figure out what your vision for your own life is. I knew from a pretty young age that I always wanted to make some kind of meaningful, positive impact. And that really strengthened after my dad's passing, because it just reminded me how short life really is. We only live about 5,000 weeks here on Earth. And I often ask myself, how do I want to spend the minutes that I have here on Earth? For me, a big part of that answer is that I want to make some kind of meaningful, positive impact in the world. To quote Steve Jobs, I want to make a dent in the universe, right? And I want our company, I want the people, I want everyone around us to be part of making that dent in the universe. So that has always been my heart. But then it was a challenge to figure out, well, what does that really look like? And initially, it was we're thinking about just growth of the business and building more units and trying to make a great experience for people. And that never really resonated. I don't know. It was exciting, but like, how are we really solving people's actual problems? And so over years of trying to understand what people were actually facing, it may seem simple now, which is the thing about great purposes and missions. They're usually not simple going into it, or not obvious to begin with. And eventually it became clear that one of the biggest problems we're facing within the United States is simply the lack of affordable housing. And so we realized that because of what we were doing with the costs, that we could actually solve that problem in the long term. In fact, if you look at it, about maybe 20 to 30% of the average American's income goes to spending on just housing. If we were to cut that in half, just imagine the abundance of resources you have as a resident. You can do more with your life, or you can work less if you so choose. And so we realized that this could actually have that kind of impact. But the problem within affordable housing is that affordable housing is done in a way where you get government grants to make the housing less expensive, and then you lower the rents as a result. That's not scalable. Housing is such a huge part of the economy that you can't move enough money from one sector of the economy into housing. And so, okay, how do you solve those issues? And what we realized is that we don't want to make affordable housing. We want to make housing affordable. And so the way that we do that is, again, by reducing those construction costs. But then what people do is they say, well, Mike, that's great. You're reducing construction costs, but I go into your website and your rents are no cheaper than anyone else. Yeah. But the reason that is again, we're trying to build the system that builds housing. And that system is 10 to 100 to 1,000 times harder to build, more costly and more complicated than to just build one project. And so we're taking the profits that we're earning and putting it into that system so that over time, our dream is over the next decade or so to reach 192,000 units with a 60,000 unit per year pace. And at that point, we're providing so much housing stock to a particular market that because of supply and demand, with the abundance of supply comes lower prices. But here is the magic. It's not just for our own residents. It's for everyone within the communities that we're building. And that's our dream.
It's a lot to unload there. Let's start from the beginning, I guess. Just a couple things that came to mind when you first started your little monologue there. One was, okay, you were willing to make mistakes, and we've talked. I think we mentioned this earlier, right? Where, and as an engineer, I just don't like making mistakes. So I've slowly trying to get accustomed to making more mistakes. And you can have a rant about the schooling system and how that sort of sets people up to not want to make mistakes, right? Exams and all that type of stuff. But I think once you realize that you're not behind anybody else or ahead of anybody else, you're just on your own path, then you're more willing to make mistakes. Is that something that you found?
Yeah, certainly. In the world of engineering, there's certain things you can't make mistakes on, right? Like life safety things. But I would say most things in the world aren't to that level. And so, honestly, I think the best way to get comfortable with making mistakes is just to start making some mistakes, right? Start doing things that you're not trying to make a mistake. You're just trying to do something new and different, and be comfortable that you're not that good. Frankly, like anytime we start something new, we're terrible at it. But as a kid, we don't care, right? We can't walk, we can't talk, we can't ride a bike, but we don't have this like negative feeling around it. But as we get older, maybe it's the schooling system, but as we get older, we become more hesitant. We feel that if we're going to do something, we should be great at it, because otherwise we're going to get ridiculed for not being good at it. But there's this interesting study, and they took two groups of people. The first group was in charge of just making the very best clay pot that they could. The second group was not told to make the best clay pot, but simply to make as many clay pots as they could. And they found that after giving both groups some time, that the first group that made one great clay pot, yeah, it was good. But the second group is where the magic happened. See, the first clay pots of the second group were terrible. But the later clay pots were much better than the ones from the first group. And so the lesson to be learned there is yes, you need to plan, you need to think things through, you need to come up with a good strategy, but don't spend too much time in there. Focus way more in just execution, because it's that execution, the failure, and that try, fail, repeat, that loop you want to do over and over again. That's what you need to get good at and get into that rhythm in order to see meaningful growth.
And I would assume that there's sort of a balance there, right? Because the group that just made as many pots as they could have just not cared at all about the quality, right? But just to give some context there for people listening, right? Like every new pot you want to try and make a little bit better, not just make 1,000 terrible pots that don't hold water. But yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
And one other thing that I heard you say there before is, and it's a little bit of an intense thing, but I forget who it was, maybe Carl Jung or some other contemporary of his, that says like everybody needs to contemplate death. And I feel like maybe people think that's a depressing thing, but I feel like it doesn't have to be, right? And everybody should do it, not to the point of depressing themselves, but just because at the end of the day, what does that mean, right? It means that your time here is limited, like you were saying, right? So it's like, oftentimes people don't, you notice it when people have tragedies in their lives and they suddenly realize like, oh, I have to make the most of this, right? And sometimes they don't realize it until they're 60 or 70, right? And then, sort of the typical American dream of like, I'm not going to live a life until I've retired and all that. But, so yeah, I mean, I recommend often, to sort of do that earlier on, and then that way you can, skip to the good part a little bit quicker. So it doesn't have to be so depressing of a thought, right?
Yeah, I remember as a kid, I was really big into special effects and 3D animation and all that. We got a bunch of people together to make this movies and stuff. It was crazy. This was sort of the time of Pixar, and we were doing 3D animation, kind of similar to them, not as good, but we were doing that as kids. And I remember one day looking out my window as I was sitting in front of my computer and noticing the leaves. And I thought, okay, we're making this really cool scene. I should spend a lot of time just making the very best leaf that I could. And I realized over time that was the wrong approach. I needed to think about what was the end game? What did I actually want to create? And focus on that bigger picture and the key elements to making that a reality. And the fundamental fallacy, the thing that I failed to understand that moment, is just what you said. Is that life is short, we don't have a lot of time. And that if we spend so much time optimizing this small thing, we're eventually going to run out of time to do the bigger pieces that we really should be focusing on.
And that bigger piece is oftentimes bigger than you can even realize, right? If you would just let go and, stop comparing yourself to other people and where they've gotten and all this. It's like, okay, this guy has, just to be a bit materialistic, he has a Ferrari, right? I want a Ferrari. Like, if you just keep on focusing on that, like, what if you could have had I don't know, like what's a better car than a Ferrari? I don't know. Oh, a Maybach. So just, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like,
a jet.
So, yeah, a jet. Even, right? There you go. That is the best example, right? Because you're going from, your mind was in 2D world when you don't realize that your potential is in 3D world, right? Like you could fly places. So yeah, I think big part of it is just comparing yourself to other people, and not forging your own path again. But yeah, so that I love the jet. That was good. But yeah, I guess the last part that I wanted to touch is sort of more on the real estate aspect of your monologue there, for lack of better words. So you're saying, I just want to like boil it down a little bit, right?
Yeah.
You are trying to create better rent just from a supply and demand sort of perspective, right? If you can just create as many buildings as you can, then you're creating more supply and therefore lowering the rent just by simple supply and demand principle. It's a little bit of a abrupt change of topic, but
no, it's true. If we can produce a lot of high quality units, that brings down pricing. You see this in a lot of different markets. Give you an example. A few hundred years ago, clothing used to be a big part of people's budgets. Very expensive, right? Because these were hand sewn, or there was some rudimentary kind of equipment to build that clothing for you. And over time, we've invented much better ways to create that clothing, to the point that we can mass produce it and basically provide all the clothing that anyone could ever want at such a high volume. And today, if you so want, like buy all your clothes at Walmart, you can actually have a full wardrobe for a very tiny part of your overall budget. But that happens as a result of driving down the cost of manufacturing and then producing so much volume that supply and demand kicks in and the pricing comes down for those in the market. And that's just what we want to do with housing. And I think it's very possible. It's hard, but it's very possible.
There's a little bit of a dangerous aspect to that as well, though, right? Because clothing at Walmart is cheap and doesn't last. So you can sort of go out the other end and build for building's sake, and then build very cheap quality housing. I mean, I know the U.S. is sort of famous for that. All these cookie cutter houses in these residential areas that are all exactly the same, and then you travel. I don't know, my mind goes like to Germany or something, where the walls are, indestructible. And obviously they have a much smaller population than the US, but how do you balance that exactly?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. One of the benefits that we have is we're not building properties for other people. And so we get to think about how do we build these buildings in a way that maximizes their long-term value. And so for us, I don't remember the exact lifespan, but I think it's something like 100 years that my engineer told me that a lot of times in other companies, they think about designing this for 50 or 100 years for a building. And we're like, that's crazy. Can we make tweaks and design changes such that this building is designed for 1,000 years or 10,000 years, right? And so we've definitely been playing with that about providing longer term asset value. Another thing to mention is, this is why I think it's important to make a distinction between affordable housing and making housing actually affordable. It's because affordable housing has that kind of notion, feeling that it's lower quality, what have you. When we have some of the top properties in our state, our newest property is 7 stories. It has a 2-story main entry that's the entire width of the building. It has a restaurant, coffee shop, thousands of square feet of amenity space. There's a brand new transit line that's stopping at the front door. We have a rooftop patio and grill. We have penthouse suites with 22-foot high ceilings with 270-degree views of downtown. It is incredible, right? We can still create awesome products. They don't have to cost an arm and a leg. Apple has done this with the iPhone, right? It used to be $10,000 for a giant brick. They've innovated. They actually have a better product today at a lower cost point. It doesn't have to be either or.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I understood there, right, is that you're incentivized to make a quality product, right? I mean, all these cookie cutter houses that I'm mentioning, they're sold immediately, right? And so then they have zero incentive to make them any higher quality because all the maintenance is up to the new owner. And so then you, as the investor, builder, and owner, right, then you're incentivized to make a building that'll last. That way you can reduce your maintenance throughout the years, right? And I'm sure you can take that into consideration in your cost projections when sort of deciding whether you want to invest in a new building or not, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's definitely a different perspective. A funny thing, I guess I said my background's in structural engineering and specifically like earthquake engineering, and in San Francisco, there's sort of a need for retrofitting buildings, and there is a city ordinance to get it done, if I remember correctly, or they're trying to push one through, and there's some political stuff going on there, but there is no incentive for the owners currently of all of some of these skyscrapers in San Francisco to actually retrofit the buildings, right? So then, and oftentimes these massive skyscrapers they're exchanged between owners every couple of years. So why would I invest in because retrofitting a building like that is insanely expensive, and the engineering is twice as expensive as designing it, at least probably per hour, and so then you see all these buildings that just won't get retrofitted, right? So as opposed to like a different country, say like London is much better. I mean, they don't have earthquakes, but they're much better about like just demanding that certain buildings get updated appropriately, right? So it's an interesting thing there. I don't know when how they're going to fix that.
The owners would care a little bit more, but I suppose if they don't own the building for more than a couple of years, there's no real incentive. They want to get in, get out, and make a profit.
Yeah, I mean, statistically speaking, right? Like the probability of an earthquake in a given year is X% or whatever, and it's minuscule for an earthquake of 8 or 9 magnitude of 8 or 9, right? Or sort of like the types of things that are detrimental, and so then they're just like, well, I'll just take that 0.0 something % and risk it, and then hope in the next 3 years that nothing. And I'm sure somebody could do the math of like the exact risk that they're taking. Maybe somebody has done it, I'm not sure. But you know what I mean? They're just like passing. They're just like, I'm willing to take that risk, and then they'll just pass it on to the next owner. So I'm sure someone's gonna comment about my my engineering, my science there, but pretty sure it's close enough. But
there you go. You're learning to be a little bit more flexible. Although I don't know if you want to be you don't want to miss that math up too much.
Yeah, there you go. But awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for joining me on here. It was great conversation. If you want to share, where people can find you, I know you have your own podcast and your own social medias and all that stuff. So if you want to share that, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah.
The best way to find us is to visit our website. That's norhart.com. It's NORHART.com. On there, you can click on something called shows, and you can see our variety of shows that we have. One of my favorite is called Zero to Unicorn. It's about the journey of small business growing to a $1 billion scale. And one of my favorite guests was Michael Uslan, who's the originator and executive producer of Batman. In fact, he was able to buy the Batman movie rights when he was fairly young, got some investors together. But it took him 10 years after that point to be able to get approval to actually make the movie a reality. That's 10 years of people slamming their door in his face, telling him no, telling him that there's no way the world wants to see a dark and serious Batman movie. But because of that, because of his tenaciousness and his energy, he actually was probably the one to spawn the world of all the new adventure comic book movies you see today. In fact, he did National Treasure Lego Movie, among others. The other thing that we have going on is our new investment platform. And if you click on invest, you can actually earn up to 10% APY, or 10% interest on your money. It's a really incredible platform, super easy to use, and those dollars actually get reinvested into the projects that we're doing to help make these real estate projects a reality. It's a great way to earn a high rate of return while helping us make these projects a reality.
Awesome. Well, you painted such a great picture of your buildings. Maybe if I'm ever in your area, I will check one of them out.
I love it. I hope you do.
Thanks again.